Every morning, more than 2 billion cups of coffee are poured around the world. It's the drink that starts conversations, fuels late-night work, and powers entire industries. Today, coffee supports the livelihoods of millions of farmers, generates hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and remains one of the world's most valuable traded commodities. Yet behind every cup lies a story far more dramatic than most people could ever imagine. Coffee didn't simply become popular because it tasted good. It sparked religious debates, challenged powerful rulers, inspired philosophers, financed colonial empires, fueled revolutions, and transformed the economies of entire continents. Kingdoms fought to control it. Merchants risked their lives to steal it. Governments tried to ban it. Some people were even imprisoned, or worse, for drinking it. Few everyday products have influenced human history on such a remarkable scale. What's even more astonishing is that none of this was planned. The global coffee industry, worth hundreds of billions of dollars today, can trace its origins back to a wild shrub growing quietly in the misty highlands of East Africa. At the time, no one could have imagined that its small red berries would one day reshape global trade, politics, science, and culture. But history often begins with the smallest accidents. According to one of the world's most enduring legends, the discovery of coffee wasn't made by a king, a scientist, or an explorer. It began with an ordinary goat herder who noticed something strange about his flock. After eating bright red berries from an unfamiliar bush, his goats suddenly became unusually energetic, refusing to sleep and leaping wildly across the hillsides. Curious, the young herder decided to investigate for himself. Whether that story is entirely true or not remains one of history's greatest mysteries. But what happened next would set humanity on a journey spanning more than 1,000 years, one filled with ambition, faith, greed, innovation, and conflict. And it all began in the mountains of Ethiopia. The story of coffee begins in the rugged highlands of Ethiopia, where dense forests still shelter the world's oldest wild Arabica coffee trees. Long before coffee was sold in cafes or traded across oceans, it grew unnoticed beneath the forest canopy, waiting for someone to discover its extraordinary secret. The most famous story centers on a young goat herder named Kaldi. According to legend, Kaldi noticed that several of his goats became unusually energetic after eating bright red berries from a wild shrub. Instead of resting at night, they ran across the hillsides, jumping and bleating with endless energy. Curious, Kaldi tasted the berries himself and experienced the same sudden burst of alertness. Whether Kaldi truly existed remains uncertain. Historians point out that the legend wasn't written down until centuries after it supposedly happened. But while the story may be impossible to prove, one fact is beyond dispute. Ethiopia is the birthplace of Coffea arabica, the species that still produces most of the world's highest quality coffee today. Long before anyone brewed coffee, local communities had already found practical ways to use the plant. Instead of roasting the beans, they crushed the ripe coffee cherries into a paste, often mixing them with animal fat to create compact, energy-rich food that hunters and travelers could carry over long distances. Coffee was valued not as a beverage, but as a source of endurance. According to another popular tradition, coffee's greatest transformation happened almost by accident. A monk, believing the mysterious berries were dangerous, threw them into a fire. As the beans roasted, they released an incredibly rich aroma that drew others in. Curious, the monks removed the roasted beans, ground them, mixed them with hot water, and created something entirely new. For the first time, coffee was no longer food. It had become a drink. The monks soon realized it helped them stay awake during long hours of prayer and meditation. News of the remarkable beverage spread through nearby religious communities, eventually reaching traders who crossed the Red Sea between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. There, in the mountains of Yemen, coffee would evolve from a local curiosity into one of the world's most valuable commodities. As coffee crossed the Red Sea into Yemen during the 15th century, it ceased to be merely a local discovery. It became a spiritual ritual, an economic treasure, and eventually, one of the world's most tightly guarded commodities. The first people to truly embrace coffee were the Sufi monks, Islamic mystics devoted to long nights of prayer and meditation. Their religious ceremonies often lasted until dawn, demanding complete concentration despite exhaustion. Coffee offered exactly what they needed, a natural way to remain awake and mentally focused without the intoxicating effects of alcohol. They called the drink kahwa, a word that would eventually evolve into the word coffee, used around the world today. Unlike the legendary monks of Ethiopia, the Sufis refined coffee into a daily practice. They experimented with roasting, grinding, and brewing the beans, gradually creating a beverage that closely resembled the coffee we know today. What began as a tool for worship soon spread beyond monasteries into homes, markets, and busy port cities. Yemen quickly realized it possessed something incredibly valuable. The mountain climate proved ideal for cultivating coffee, and production expanded rapidly across the country's steep terraces. Soon, nearly every sack of coffee destined for foreign markets passed through one bustling harbor on the Red Sea, the port of Mocha. For more than 2 centuries, Mocha became the center of the global coffee trade. Even today, when people order a mocha, they are unknowingly speaking the name of a Yemeni port that once controlled the world's coffee supply. But Yemen had no intention of sharing its advantage. Officials feared that if other nations obtained fertile coffee seeds, they could grow the crop themselves and destroy Yemen's monopoly. To prevent this, exported beans were often boiled or partially roasted before leaving the country, making them impossible to plant. Merchants carefully guarded trade routes, and living coffee plants were rarely allowed beyond Yemen's borders. For a time, the strategy worked. Every nation that wanted coffee had to buy it from Yemen. Yet history has shown that monopolies rarely last forever. As demand exploded across the Middle East and beyond, merchants, explorers, and ambitious empires began searching for ways to break Yemen's control. The world's most valuable plant had become the target of spies, smugglers, and colonial powers, and its next destination would transform entire civilizations. By the early 16th century, coffee had spread far beyond Yemen. It followed merchants, pilgrims, and scholars into the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire, where it evolved from a religious beverage into one of history's most powerful social forces. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, and Mecca soon filled with coffee houses. But these weren't cafes in the modern sense. They were vibrant public spaces where people gathered to exchange ideas, debate politics, hear storytellers, play chess, and discuss the latest news from across the empire. For many ordinary citizens, the coffee house became something entirely new, a place where social class mattered less than conversation. Historians often describe these establishments as the first true public forums of the early modern world. Long before newspapers reached the masses, information traveled from table to table inside crowded coffee houses. Merchants shared business opportunities, poets recited their latest work, scholars debated philosophy, and travelers brought stories from distant lands. Coffee wasn't simply bringing people together. It was helping ideas spread faster than ever before. That growing influence made many rulers deeply uncomfortable. Authorities soon realized that whenever large groups gathered regularly to talk freely, criticism of the government often followed. Rumors spread quickly. Political opinions gained momentum. Public dissatisfaction became difficult to control. To some officials, coffee houses looked less like places to drink and more like places where opposition could quietly organize. Several attempts were made to stop coffee's rise. In 1511, the governor of Mecca declared coffee an intoxicant and ordered coffee houses closed, arguing that the drink violated religious law. The ban created widespread resistance and was eventually overturned by higher authorities. allowing coffee to return almost immediately. The harshest crackdown came over a century later, under Sultan Murad IV. Determined to strengthen his authority, Murad outlawed coffee throughout the empire. Coffee houses were shut down, and severe punishments were imposed on anyone caught violating the ban. According to later historical accounts, the Sultan sometimes disguised himself and wandered Istanbul's streets at night, personally searching for offenders. Whether every detail of these stories is entirely accurate remains debated by historians. What is certain, however, is that coffee had become so influential that one of the world's most powerful empires considered an ordinary drink a threat to political stability. But despite every ban, coffee continued spreading. The Ottoman Empire could restrict its own citizens, but it could no longer stop coffee from crossing into Europe, where an entirely new chapter of its history was about to begin. By the early 1600s, coffee had crossed the Mediterranean and arrived in Europe through the busy trading ports of Venice. At first, many Europeans viewed the unfamiliar black drink with suspicion. It came from the Muslim world, carried strange customs, and quickly attracted both curiosity and controversy. Some Catholic leaders even condemned coffee as the devil's drink, arguing that Christians should reject a beverage so closely associated with the Islamic world. The debate eventually reached Pope Clement V, who was asked to ban coffee entirely. Instead of condemning it immediately, the Pope decided to taste it for himself. Legend says that after taking a sip, he found the drink so enjoyable that he jokingly remarked it would be a shame to leave such a wonderful beverage only to non-Christians. Whether his exact words were ever spoken remains uncertain, but his approval helped remove one of coffee's greatest obstacles in Europe. Once accepted, coffee spread with astonishing speed. Coffee houses opened across Venice, London, Paris, Vienna, and Amsterdam, becoming gathering places for merchants, scientists, writers, and politicians. Unlike taverns where alcohol often clouded judgment, coffee houses encouraged clear thinking and lively discussion. In England, they became so influential that people nicknamed them penny universities. For the price of a single cup of coffee, anyone could join conversations about science, philosophy, economics, or world affairs. Wealth mattered less than ideas, and talented thinkers could debate alongside merchants and craftsmen. Some of Europe's most important institutions were born inside these coffee houses. Lloyd's Coffee House eventually grew into Lloyd's of London, one of the world's largest insurance markets. Another famous meeting place, Jonathan's Coffee House, became the foundation of what would later evolve into the London Stock Exchange. Inventors, investors, and entrepreneurs often met over coffee to exchange ideas that would shape the modern economy. Coffee also fueled the Age of Enlightenment. Writers, philosophers, and scientists, including figures such as Voltaire, Isaac Newton, and Benjamin Franklin, frequented coffee houses where ideas flowed as freely as the drinks themselves. Many historians believe these lively discussions helped accelerate scientific discovery, political reform, and intellectual progress throughout Europe. But Europe's growing love for coffee created a serious problem. Demand exploded, yet nearly every coffee bean still came from Yemen. As prices climbed and supplies tightened, European empires realized that buying coffee was no longer enough. They wanted to grow it themselves, and to do that, someone would first have to steal the world's most valuable plant. By the late 1600s, Europe had developed an insatiable appetite for coffee. Every year, ships returned from Yemen carrying precious cargo that sold for enormous profits. But there was one problem: Europe had no control over its own supply. As long as Yemen held the only viable coffee plants, every European kingdom remained dependent on a single source. That dependence was unacceptable. Soon, merchants, explorers, and colonial powers began searching for a way to break Yemen's monopoly. They didn't need shiploads of beans. They only needed one living coffee plant. The first major breakthrough came from the Dutch East India Company, one of the most powerful trading organizations in history. Dutch traders secretly acquired live coffee plants and transported them to botanical gardens in Amsterdam. Once the plants adapted successfully, seedlings were shipped to Dutch colonies across Asia, especially the island of Java. The experiment was a remarkable success. Java's volcanic soil and tropical climate proved almost perfect for growing coffee. Production expanded rapidly, and before long, the island had become one of the world's largest coffee-producing regions. Even today, people still use the word Java as another name for coffee, a reminder of the island's extraordinary role in coffee history. But the Dutch were not the only empire determined to profit. France soon launched its own mission. In 1723, a young French naval officer named Gabriel de Clou received a single coffee seedling to transport from Paris to the Caribbean island of Martinique. The journey across the Atlantic was anything but easy. His ship encountered violent storms, faced the constant threat of pirates, and eventually ran dangerously low on fresh water. According to one famous account, de Clou sacrificed part of his own daily drinking water to keep the fragile coffee plant alive throughout the voyage. Against all odds, the seedling survived. Once planted in Martinique, it flourished in the island's rich volcanic soil. Within only a few decades, millions of coffee trees across the French Caribbean could trace their origins back to that single surviving plant. Yet the most extraordinary story was still to come. Portugal desperately wanted coffee for its vast colony of Brazil, but France refused to share its valuable seedlings. Rather than using military force, Portugal turned to diplomacy and, according to popular tradition, a little romance. In 1727, Brazilian officer Francisco de Melo Paleta was sent to French Guiana on what appeared to be a routine diplomatic mission. Before returning home, he reportedly received a farewell bouquet from the governor's wife. Hidden among the flowers were fertile coffee seeds. Those few concealed seeds changed history. Once planted in Brazil, coffee spread rapidly across the country's fertile lands. Within little more than a century, Brazil had become the world's largest coffee producer, a position it continues to hold today. The world's most valuable crop hadn't been conquered through war. It had been stolen, smuggled, and quietly carried across oceans. But the rapid expansion of coffee plantations would come at a terrible human cost. As coffee plantations spread across the Caribbean, South America, and Southeast Asia, they generated extraordinary wealth. European empires competed fiercely to expand production, and global demand seemed endless. But behind every successful plantation stood a reality that was far less inspiring. Coffee had become one of the driving forces behind the colonial economy. Growing coffee was incredibly labor-intensive. Forests had to be cleared, young trees planted by hand, ripe cherries carefully harvested, and beans processed before they could be shipped across the Atlantic. Plantation owners wanted the highest possible profits at the lowest possible cost, and many turned to enslaved labor to achieve it. Across colonies controlled by the Dutch, French, Portuguese, and other European powers, millions of enslaved Africans were forced to work on coffee plantations under brutal conditions. They labored from sunrise until sunset in tropical heat, often receiving little food, inadequate shelter, and almost no medical care. For plantation owners, replacing exhausted workers was frequently considered cheaper than improving their living conditions. Nowhere was this system more significant than Brazil. As coffee production expanded throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Brazil transformed into the world's largest coffee producer. Its economy became deeply dependent on coffee exports, and that success relied heavily on enslaved workers. Historians estimate that millions of enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil during the transatlantic slave trade, many of them forced onto vast coffee estates. The profits were enormous. European merchants, shipping companies, commodity traders, and wealthy landowners accumulated fortunes from coffee exports. while those who planted, harvested, and processed the crop rarely shared in the wealth they created. Coffee also helped reshape history in unexpected ways. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, the harsh realities of plantation life contributed to growing resistance among enslaved people. That resistance eventually erupted into the Haitian Revolution, one of history's most successful slave uprisings, permanently changing the balance of power in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, Brazil continued expanding its coffee empire until slavery was finally abolished in 1888, becoming the last country in the Western Hemisphere to officially end the institution. By then, coffee had become far more than a popular drink. It was woven into global trade, colonial expansion, financial markets, and the rise of modern capitalism. Yet coffee's influence was still growing. Across the Atlantic, another historic event was about to transform coffee, from a luxury enjoyed by the wealthy into the everyday drink of an entirely new nation. By the late 1700s, coffee had already conquered Europe, but across the Atlantic, it was about to find its most devoted audience, and a political revolution would help make it happen. In 1773, tensions between Britain and its American colonies reached a breaking point. To protest British taxation, a group of colonists boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water, in what became known as the Boston Tea Party. The event changed more than politics. It changed what Americans drank. Tea, once the most common beverage in the colonies, suddenly became associated with British rule. Many patriots refused to drink it, seeing coffee as a symbol of independence instead. Almost overnight, coffee replaced tea on breakfast tables, in taverns, and in public meeting places throughout the colonies. As the United States grew, so did its appetite for coffee. Coffeehouses became gathering places where merchants discussed business, politicians debated the nation's future, and newspapers exchanged information. The drink that had once energized monks in Yemen was now helping shape a young republic. Its importance became even more obvious during the American Civil War. Union soldiers received coffee as part of their regular field rations, and many considered it almost as essential as food. They roasted green beans over campfires, ground them by hand, and brewed coffee whenever they had the chance. Letters from soldiers often mentioned coffee as one of the greatest comforts during long campaigns. Confederate troops, cut off from international trade, faced severe shortages. Many were forced to brew substitutes made from roasted chicory, sweet potatoes, or even acorns, but none could truly replace real coffee. By the time the First and Second World Wars arrived, coffee had become an official part of military life. Millions of cups were served to soldiers to help them stay alert during exhausting marches, freezing nights, and dangerous combat operations. Instant coffee became especially valuable because it was lightweight, easy to transport, and could be prepared almost anywhere. When the wars ended, veterans returned home with the coffee habits they had developed overseas. Coffee was no longer simply a beverage. It had become part of the American lifestyle. Yet, just as coffee reached the height of its popularity, something unexpected happened. The quality began to decline, and the industry faced one of its biggest turning points in history. By the 1960s, coffee was everywhere in America, but it wasn't getting better. As demand continued to rise, many large coffee companies focused on producing beans as cheaply and quickly as possible. Lower quality coffee was blended into mass-market products, roasting became increasingly standardized, and freshness was sacrificed for longer shelf life. The result was disappointing. Millions of Americans still drank coffee every morning, but much of it had become weak, bitter, and forgettable. Younger generations began turning away from the drink, and for the first time in decades, coffee consumption started to decline. It seemed as though coffee had lost the magic that had captivated the world for centuries. Then, in 1971, 3 friends opened a small store in Seattle called Starbucks. At first, the company didn't serve lattes or cappuccinos. It simply sold high-quality roasted coffee beans and brewing equipment, hoping to teach customers that coffee could be far more than an ordinary supermarket product. The real transformation came a decade later. In 1982, a young marketing executive named Howard Schultz joined the company. During a business trip to Milan, Italy, he was fascinated by the city's espresso bars. People weren't just buying coffee, they were gathering, talking, relaxing, and enjoying the experience together. Schultz realized that America wasn't missing coffee. It was missing coffee culture. After acquiring Starbucks, he transformed the company into a chain of welcoming cafes, where customers came not only for better coffee, but also for conversation, comfort, and community. The idea proved revolutionary. Within a few decades, Starbucks expanded from a single neighborhood shop into one of the world's most recognizable brands, inspiring thousands of independent cafes along the way. At the same time, a new movement known as third wave coffee began to emerge. Instead of treating coffee as a simple commodity, roasters and baristas started focusing on where each bean came from, how it was grown, and how it should be brewed to highlight its unique flavors. Coffee was no longer just fuel for the morning. It became a craft, much like fine wine. Consumers began paying attention to origin, altitude, processing methods, and roasting techniques. Farmers who once sold anonymous beans were finally recognized for producing exceptional coffee. More than 1,000 years after its discovery in Ethiopia, coffee had completed another remarkable transformation. It had become both an everyday necessity and an artisanal experience. But perhaps the most remarkable part of coffee's story isn't how much it has changed. It's how much of human history is still hidden inside every single cup. Today, coffee is grown in more than 70 countries, supporting the livelihoods of over 125 million people. Brazil remains the world's largest producer, while Vietnam has become the second largest through its vast Robusta plantations. Meanwhile, Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee, continues to produce some of the world's most celebrated Arabica beans. From a wild shrub growing in the forests of East Africa to a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, coffee has traveled farther than almost any other crop in human history. Its journey was never simple. It passed through monasteries, crossed dangerous oceans, survived wars, inspired philosophers, enriched empires, and transformed economies. It was protected by merchants, stolen by smugglers, cultivated by enslaved workers, embraced by revolutionaries, and reinvented by entrepreneurs. Very few everyday products carry such a complicated legacy. The next time you hold a cup of coffee, you're holding more than roasted beans and hot water. You're holding centuries of exploration, faith, ambition, innovation, conflict, and resilience, all distilled into a single drink. What began as a mysterious berry in the Ethiopian highlands became a force that helped shape the modern world. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of the story. Coffee never changed history because it was the strongest drink. It changed history because it brought people together, kept minds awake, inspired new ideas, and quietly influenced countless moments that shaped civilization itself. The story of coffee is, in many ways, the story of us. So the next time you take that first sip in the morning, you may find yourself appreciating it a little differently, knowing that every cup carries 1,000 years of human history.